Hello, everyone. This is Hano. Thank you for joining our webinar today on successfully integrating HR processes with identity management. Ron, I see you've just joined.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Okay.
So let's start off with the presentation formalities. A little bit of introduction is in order. My name is Hano Ekdahl. I'm the founder of Idenhaus. And my primary role, other than being a founder, is an identity management strategist. And we also have Ron Bowern on the phone. Ron?
Thanks, Hano. Yeah, my name is Ron Bauer, and I'm the Director of Identity and Access Management Services for Idenhaus.
Thanks, Ron. I thought we'd start off with a little poll here, just see what industries we have across the board. So I'm going to send that out to everyone, see what verticals we have represented. See the responses starting to come in. Give it another few seconds here. All right, I'm going to stop it here and share the results. So pretty good representation across a variety of different industries. Other is the most selected option here, but healthcare, financial services, insurance, manufacturing, consumer packaged goods, pretty good broad spectrum. We're excited to be here and present on this topic. And we also wanted to share that we're going to be at the Gartner Identity and Access Management Summit coming up in December. If you'd like to meet with us face-to-face. A lot of times these conversations are nice through a webinar and emails, and we interact in a number of ways, but actually being able to sit down together and talk about a specific problem or issue you're having is a big deal and a great opportunity to get to know each other better. So if you want to reach out to info@idenhaus.com, you can reach us there, and we can schedule a time to chat, whether it's over breakfast or at lunch or in between sessions. So in today's conversation, we're going to talk about HR processes and how they drive most of the identity management experience. Key benefits that you're going to get out of this presentation today is we're going to help you decrease the time to implement your identity management solution. We're going to help you drive costs not only out of the implementation process, but also out of the operations and support after you deploy, as well as helping you optimize process design. So let's get started. One of the most staggering statistics that you'll find across third-party research agencies, you talk to any of the big four consultancies that are out doing surveys of their customers, that more than half of identity management projects fail the first time. You are more likely to toss a coin in the air and call heads and get it right than you are to implement identity management successfully.
Hano, I'm not actually seeing the slides.
You're not seeing the slides?
I am not.
All right, thank you for saying something.
There we go.
How's that?
That works.
I appreciate that. I apologize. So let's go back. So 50% of identity and access management projects fail the first time. And not coincidentally, more than 50% of business process reengineering projects fail because of their broad scope. And identity and access management projects inherently have a business process reengineering component in them And so these two statistics are strongly correlated. And most organizations that implement identity management do not consider how process impacts their implementation. And 4 out of 5 executives say that their IAM systems don't deliver enough value even when they are implemented successfully and don't flat out fail. One of the reasons for that is because we don't lead with process analysis, so we miss requirements and thus deliver less value to the business. This leads to a lot of workarounds in our processes, sneaker net, if you will, where people are running around fulfilling things outside of the system. And operations and support costs tend to be much higher than expected because the system has not automated the tasks that we hope to automate when we built identity management in the first place. So what are some of the common challenges that are hamstringing us here and setting us back? Well, most organizations just don't have experience with identity and access management. They've never built it before, so they don't understand that we're not really installing a technology product that functions on its own. It's not like implementing Microsoft Outlook or Exchange to manage your email. This actually integrates tightly with upstream processes on the HR side, as well as downstream processes on the provisioning and fulfillment side, and it touches the end user experience in a very profound way. And so processes are not considered as part of the identity management project up front and are really an afterthought when things fall flat on their face and break down. Another common challenge we also see is that businesses operate in silos, right? HR has their set of responsibilities, IT has its set of responsibilities, application owners and different lines of business have their responsibilities, and they're very focused on achieving their goals within their department or division, which leads to a lack of stakeholder alignment. So it's difficult to find the win for everybody if you're treating this as a typical technology project and not looking more broadly to building a bridge with HR and other stakeholders to have a holistic solution. So how can we beat the odds here and deliver a successful identity management project? Well, it clearly doesn't work as one-sided fixes. We can't treat this as a project that one group in the organization can successfully implement. And if we look at the complexity of the identity management lifecycle, it's pretty obvious that there's a lot that has to come together in order to make a user functional and that they have the right level of access to the applications and assets they need in order to be a productive worker in the organization, right? So they come into the organization as a new hire. On that first day, they're going to need the most assets, right? They're going to need a place to sit. They're going to need a workstation. They may need a badge in order to get in the building. There's a variety of other things that need to come together and a whole bunch of processes that have to work together in order to be successful. So we can think too about the stakeholders here who are involved in this process, right? We have HR who agrees to bring the person on board. We have the application owners who want to give this user access to their app so they can do work. We have asset provisioning, finance, accounting. There's a whole range of different stakeholders that have to work together to make this life cycle work. And so we need to break down the silos and approach the problem in a different way. So one way to solve this difficult problem is to begin with a methodology. Methodologies drive results, right? We want to balance the amount of analysis we do against the amount of building we do where we're going forward without a clear understanding of the problems we're trying to solve. And a methodology helps us balance that out, right? We're all under pressure to get something done. But most organizations choose a path that almost guarantees failure. They have a few meetings and then they start coding. So it's a build and pray scenario. And there's a number of reasons for this. Some of it's driven by slow decision making, perhaps on the business side, where they eat up a large amount of the project timeline, trying to select a vendor or a technology. And yet they have a fixed delivery date that they're not willing to move. And so then we wind up trimming testing, we trim our analysis, and we try and code something to deliver some sort of results in the time that we have. But if you were building a building, would you really want to do it that way? You would want to have an architect who made some plans, you build some models, you pull together some blueprints, you review everything. Is the site even suitable to build a 20-story structure on? Can it support the weight? Are we going to have a good foundation? We can help you get on the right side of the percentages here by using a mature methodology to lead you through the process and make sure that everything works together. So the goal here is for us to find a better way, right? So a methodology structures our approach in solving the problem. We want to be future focused, placing the emphasis and efforts on where we want to be, right? Understanding the problems where we are, and also making sure that we paint a vision of that future state so we can build a plan to get there. So the goal is to drive accuracy, right? We need good data, which begins with the HR processes that drive the user identity lifecycle in the first place. When we onboard someone, when they get promoted, when they transfer, when they move from one country to another, and ultimately when they separate from the company, we need to have accurate data on that user so we can adjust their access and also spawn any dependent processes to provision additional assets that that user may need. And a key component here also that's often overlooked is timeliness. So good data is great to drive all that, but if you don't get a termination, for example, in a timely fashion, the person leaves the organization, but we haven't turned off their access. So can HR get us the data when we need it so we can act timely, or are we going to be stuck with another workaround here and have inconsistent results? So next I want to talk about 5 keys to a successful identity and access management project, right? How can we move forward in a more thoughtful way to reduce the risks and get on the right side of the percentages here? Our recommendation is to begin with the onboarding process, right? So if we keep in mind that implementing identity management is just like building an office building, I think a lot of our problems here would go away, right? We draw up detailed plans, we're going to do some analysis, we're going to understand exactly where the pain points are and test each step along the way and test our assumptions and make sure we leave nothing to chance. In identity management projects, a lot of times if we haven't started writing code in a month or two, we think that something's wrong and we're not making good progress. A lot of these projects fail because we just don't recognize up front that we need to apply good design principles to these implementation projects, just as if we were going to build an office building. And HR processes are a key component in making that work. So we look at just the HR process for onboarding a candidate. You can see there's a whole bunch of tasks that have to get completed here, right? There's things the candidates have to do, there's things the managers have to do, and then there's a number of HR staff tasks that also have to come together in order to create a functioning user record in the HR system, to meet the regulatory controls that are in place there, to get them paid. And so the onboarding So one of the staggering statistics about onboarding in general is that 1 in 3 workers quits their jobs within the first 6 months. I don't know if you knew that. 1 in 3 workers quits within the first 6 months, and one of the primary reasons for that is that they have a poor onboarding experience. So right here we have a win for the HR team. If we can help them improve the onboarding experience, drive up retention of workers, and eliminate some of that attrition, we've identified something that will catch their interest right off the bat and answer the "what's in it for me" question. So I've got a sample current state onboarding process. I've blanked out a number of the boxes here so you guys don't try and read everything all at once. It can be a little distracting. And before I dive into this too much, I thought I'd ask you a question here. So I'm going to launch this little survey. So the question is, does your organization have documented processes? Thank you for voting. I'll give it a few more seconds. So we can get a couple more people to respond. All right, so looking at the results, about just under a third said that you have well-documented processes, and more than half said they're partially documented, which is really what we see a lot of the time, is that there's some documentation, but it's not as fleshed out as you might like in order to really drive an understanding of the systems and processes and how they come together. So if we go back and look at our current onboarding process example, so remember, this is a current state, right? So this is an organization that does not have identity management and is doing work in ticketing systems and emails and other manual processes in order to get a user on board. And some of the questions they need to ask themselves are, what data is available? So here we are setting up a user in the system of record, and there's some initiator who's doing that work, whether it's on talent acquisition or the hiring manager in this case. And so they're probably putting in first name, last name. Hopefully they're putting in the manager and other attributes that we need to manage that user identity. But we really need to understand today what data is available in the system of record, whether in this case it's a SharePoint site or some database that we're using to provide data to downstream systems. Later on in the process, we have IT admins that are creating the user ID. And the question that occurs to me here is this the right sequence of events? We're creating the user ID, but we've already set up the user in the system of record. So is there some process to get that user ID back into the system of record so that we have the user ID to synchronize around and make available to other systems? Are there other things that are dependent on that user ID, whether it's creating a badge or setting up a workstation? And is that data available when we need it? So is it the right sequence? Is a great question to ask. And then if we look too at dependent process here, if we look at asset management at the bottom of the page, one of the things that workers need is IT access, or most workers need IT access. If they're doing any kind of knowledge work, they're going to need to log in, they're going to have email, they're going to have to do time reporting, they're going to have to work in applications, and there's some lead time for provisioning that workstation to the user. And so that is an area that oftentimes is overlooked, and it's something that needs to be considered. So if we think about HR driving the user identity, they need to understand that they're having an impact all the way through the process. They have an impact on what data is available. So if we identify the fact that there's an issue with the data, or we need more fields, we can make that requirement known and work with HR to get it. If we know that the SLA for assets is 5 days, then we need to also understand what tasks or what events in the HR system we can create a user identity off of if we're going to automate, so that we don't actually degrade service by linking things together. So imagine, if you will, if we're onboarding a user and today an email goes out and the hiring manager says, hey, I'm onboarding Bob, you need to start building his workstation. Great, they start building a workstation for Bob. But if we're automating that, and HR is not entering the data into the HR system in a timely fashion, then what we can wind up with is that Bob gets onboarded, but his data record's not complete until his first day of work, or even possibly a bit later. And then he winds up waiting for a workstation. And so we've actually degraded service because we didn't understand that dependency downstream on the HR data, how it interacts with identity management, and how downstream processes are dependent on that data. Which is a good segue into point 2, which is evaluating dependent processes. Workstation provisioning, physical access badging. There are a number of others that impact the end user experience. So if we look at core dependent processes here, or areas where we have dependencies as well, background checks are an area where a lot of organizations struggle. So they may have a background check step in their process somewhere, and that step can take anywhere from a week to 2 months, depending on whether the data is available, whether the forms were filled out properly, and how aggressively that background check is completed. Today, there may be workaround steps where user IDs and badges are issued even without the background check complete. But any organization that's looking to close security holes will want to make sure that the background check is done before they do any provisioning. So how do we accommodate that dependency and that potential bottleneck? On the downstream side, we also have a remedy ticketing system, in this case, where someone is manually entering ticket requests in order to provision the user. Now, this is obviously an area that's ripe for improvement with an identity management solution. And today, though, there are probably a number of workarounds to exchange data back and forth across people and systems in order to get the right data in the right place at the right time so that someone can fulfill that request. But we also have some issues here where a ticket may not have been issued manually to the right person in order to fulfill the request. So is the user really going to have everything they need on the first day? So getting back to, are we providing a good onboarding experience? Are we providing value to the end user? The answer is probably no. So here's a great opportunity to integrate with the HR process and eliminate these workarounds by having a system that flows from end to end. Ron, is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I do know that a lot of times the HR department gets a little bit worried when you start letting them know how some of their processes could impact automation of delivery of credentials. So it's also important to make sure that they understand what processes you're going to put in place for stop gaps, so they don't feel that if they make a mistake, they've created some sort of boondoggle on the back end.
Okay. Thanks, Ron. The next area to look at in your processes, if you're looking at HR process and downstream fulfillment process, the end-to-end, is to look for bottlenecks and data quality issues. One thing to understand is what are HR's priorities in terms of creating the user record. And a lot of organizations where HR has not been integrated with identity management yet, you'll find that they are incented to get the user record created 2 to 3 days before the first payroll is run, which oftentimes is after the worker has started work and shown up on their first day. That is clearly something that needs to be changed and addressed with HR so that they're giving us the data as soon as possible. We also need to understand where things bog down in the process so that we can tackle those points and make sure that fulfillment happens timely, as well as addressing any knowledge gaps, right? Does everyone have the right information and training to understand how the processes come together? So we're talking about setting up the user in a system of record. In our future state, identity management is going to provide the central hub that integrates with our system of record, which is going to be the HR system for employees in particular, possibly for contractors as well. And it will synchronize that data around. So is all the data there that we need in order to manage the user lifecycle? So one key data element, for example, is the user's manager. Do we have the manager information on that worker? If I need something to be approved, if I'm going to bill something to that manager's cost center, that data has to be accurate in order for the workflow to work. Otherwise, identity management will fall flat. It is a rules-based system, and if we don't have the data to execute the rules, we wind up with a system that doesn't deliver the results that we had hoped for. Now, the thing about data quality that's also a challenge is that it can be an issue that makes HR feel very vulnerable. HR is going to be creating that user identity, and if they don't have good controls and processes in place to maintain that data, and the data is stale or incorrect, you can wind up with old manager data or bad cost center data bad contact information, which can really drive a negative user experience from end to end. It's important to look at those data quality issues early in collaboration with the HR team, and then help the HR team identify ways to improve data quality, especially around key attributes that are required for identity management. Now here we call out the bottleneck around remedy, but bottlenecks can really be anywhere. They can be in the HR processes where we're waiting on an approval or we're waiting for a task to complete in the onboarding process. It can be in downstream systems and we're waiting on another task to be completed and the next task can't start executing until it's done. It's important to identify those bottlenecks, focus on them, understand why they occur, and also identify ways that we can mitigate the impact of those. Is there a way we can change that process in order to remove that issue? Or is it possible for us to get enough data to move the user forward in the process, even though we don't have all the data yet, knowing that we'll get it later on? The fourth step we recommend is creating a data map. So we've driven home the point, I believe, that user access is driven by what data we have on the user. It determines their relationship with the organization. It determines what they should be able to see. And what we need to do is make it very clear what data elements drive account creation and access for our users. So if we look at this current slide, we see here, this is really our desired future state. We have a set of authoritative sources on the left-hand side, where we establish the user identity. We maintain the user identity, whether it's for an employee in the HR system, a contractor maybe in the HR system, or a separate database or a vendor management system. We synchronize that data to the central identity store to establish that identity, and then it is in turn used by service directories, workflow tools, and applications in order to provide access and provision assets and resources to the user. A data map makes it explicit which fields are synchronizing across, how they're mapped, and whether there are any data transformations required along the way. So your first name in the human resources system may be called first name, but in Active Directory it's CN, which is short for common name. So how do we understand how all the data moves through the system, how it's formatted, if there are any hiccups or issues we're going to face along the way because there's a data type issue or a data field needs to be transformed, and what is actually important for the downstream applications to have on that user to give them the right level of access. And so we can come up with a prioritized list of attributes on the user record and understand what data we really need out of our HR system. Anything you'd like to add here, Ron?
Not really. But there is a desire by a lot of the HR team to understand, when they make changes to the data, how will it impact the overall process. I also get a lot of questions, as you show on this slide, about contractors, especially when they're rotating from a contractor to a full-time employee, that workflow process as well.
Thanks, Ron. The last tip is getting expert help. So that expert help can be within your own four walls, having people who have implemented identity and access management before. They understand what components need to come together. They have a sound methodology and can lead you through the analysis phase into the implementation. And they really understand both strategy as well as technical implementation, the nuts and bolts of getting it done. So without an eye to strategy and a vision for how all the components have to come together, it's very difficult to define your end state, which makes it even harder to hit it and get it right. So the methodology slide I have here is really about the Pareto principle. It's about an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. You can spend 10 to 20% of your time doing analysis, planning, and structuring in order to drive the remaining 80% of your work and be successful and hit your target. So a lot of organizations focus on the implementation off the bat. Requirements designed either a typical software development lifecycle, or they take an agile approach. you're looking at 12 to 24 months to implement an identity and access management solution. And they skip over or give short shrift to an analysis and assessment, identifying where their gaps are, and then making a plan not only to address those gaps, but to phase the project in manageable chunks to deliver on the timeline. And if we think about this, we're looking at anywhere from 4 to 5 weeks of upfront time to lay out a strategy, do the assessment, identify the issues. There's a lot of complexity on the onboarding processes, and it makes it very difficult to clearly identify what the issues or problems are that are driving effectiveness and the end user experience. It's often very difficult to pinpoint exactly what's wrong and apply that knowledge to a better process supported by your identity management solution that resolves the underlying issues. And so a process map and a methodology makes the pathway from a candidate who's looking at joining your company to a fully provisioned worker much more transparent, because each step is described. It makes it easier to highlight any problems and propose solutions to those problems as you go through the process. The conversations, workshops, and meetings also drive alignment across the stakeholders. It helps you identify what's in it for each stakeholder, what HR gets, a better onboarding experience, better worker retention, which is something they're incented for. It eliminates the amount of administrative work for system administrators who don't have to work as hard to get workers into and out of their applications. And it improves security, auditability, and reporting so we understand who has access to what and makes us more efficient in our daily operations. Ron, anything you'd like to add?
No, I think you covered it pretty well.
So I'd like to leave you now with some key takeaways, a little summary of what we talked about today. One of the key points that we started with is that methodology drives action. It's very important to have a process that leads you through a structured sequence of events to understand the problems, their root cause, what's actually causing the issue, discuss and identify solutions, figure out what's important and impactful so you can prioritize your efforts to focus on the most high impact projects first, and then start building your solution. So do the analysis before we start coding. Process mapping is a key component not only to understanding the end-to-end flow, but to driving out requirements, to helping HR understand the impact they're having on the end users, to identify dependencies in how our technology works with our processes. It drives stakeholder engagement. So we talked about the stakeholders from asset management, physical security and badging, finance, accounting, all the way up to HR. They each have something to gain by integrating with the identity and access management solution that we're in the process of building. The thing about HR is they wind up driving the experience downstream that application owners and the identity management team have, because the events in their system drive the reaction in the IT systems to adjust, manage, and maintain user access. So getting all the stakeholders aligned, bringing them together, breaking down the silos, eliminating the political risk, and getting stakeholders aligned is a critical success factor for any identity and access management project. And the nice thing about process mapping is it's a way to bring everyone together, understand their needs, understand their requirements, and build a bridge to start building a collaborative environment to solving those problems. And the last takeaway is that data maps and data quality drive most everything in identity management. The individual attributes on the worker, the availability and quality of that data allow the identity management solution to make decisions based on policy and business rules, who gets what, when do they get it. And as data quality improves, we're able to drive a better outcome for the organization. So I wanted to thank you for your time. If you have questions, you can click on the question button, I believe, and submit them, and Ron and I are happy to answer them as we go here. So I'll give you guys a minute to ask a few questions. So we got asked, what is the hard dollar cost per person of doing a manual process compared to an identity and access management process? The good news is I actually have some of that data. The bad news is I don't have it at my fingertips, so it's very hard for me to answer that off the top of my head here. Ron, I don't know if you've tackled that one recently and have some statistics at your fingertips that you can share. If not, I'm happy to follow up in an email with an answer to that question.
Yeah, and it really does come down to the actual business process you're talking about in some cases. For example, we had a customer who was using 6 different ticketing systems to which each employee had to be fully trained on it. So we took that into the cost factor. And, so if you're only using, it depends on how many different processes the automation is actually replacing. So it is situational basis, but there is some general guidelines that we can provide.
Thanks, Ron. Another question we have here is, what about the users where the book of record is not HR? Does IDM and IT end up owning that? The answer to that can be sometimes. So we've seen organizations that will use a ticketing system, like Remedy, for example, as their book of record. We've seen organizations use a database with a web front end and build some process around that, in particular for managing contractors, for example. That sometimes is owned by the business, and sometimes IDM does wind up owning that user lifecycle management. So we don't recommend that. The reason we don't recommend that is that HR has so many legal requirements and so many fulfillment requirements around things such as payroll and reporting for EEOC and other things, that their data is going to be well maintained because they have to maintain it, and you're just going to get better results if you integrate with HR. Now, if you're not able to integrate directly with HR, one thing you can do is process flat files. So we've seen organizations that have difficulty integrating with HR, at least off the bat, and what they'll do is get a flat file, even if it's a nightly batch, so that they at least have the best data available on a daily basis to drive provisioning events. Next question, do we often see the processes are not documented and have to be completed before the project can continue? So yes, we see that processes are not documented or are not documented well. One of the things that we didn't show in today's presentation is what a future state process map looks like. So when we do process maps and we're defining the future state and how the solution comes together, we'll have call outs that show what data attributes are available in different steps. Do we have the complete set of attributes? Do we not have the complete set of attributes? Based on what data we have at which step, what are we able to do with the user identity? And that will inform the capabilities of the system at any particular point in time. One of the things about documenting the processes that's so powerful is that you can then socialize it across different stakeholder groups and get their feedback, and also help them see where the problems are and help them understand their impact on the solution. So we do see projects that wind up failing, or at least slowing down and realizing they have to go back and complete the process maps before the project can continue. So yes, that does happen. Another question we have is, do we recommend having an identity and access management administrator come on board after you implement an identity and access management solution? So the answer to that question is yes, although I would put a caveat there and say we actually recommend that an identity and access management admin start before this project is complete, so that during the implementation they can, number one, participate, and number two, benefit from the knowledge transfer from the team that they're working with to build out the solution. Part of the power of having that type of collaborative relationship is that the IDM admin or IAM admin will have the context for the decisions that were made in the design and understand the why behind the what in order to properly administer the systems.
Yeah, and Hanno, some of what we've experienced, some of the customers, is through the automation process, they're finding that rather than a reduction in staff necessarily, the automation and administration of the new system, they take an internal resource and promote them to that role, right? As opposed to looking outside the organization, because they've been in the organization, they understand the people and the politics, and those administrators can then apply the policies and get approvals, typically because they already have the relationships within the organization.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. Good point. Next question, for identity and access governance, such as segregation of duties, how would you do the analysis? Crossing HR data with end system authorizations, question mark. Ron, you want to take that one?
Ask the question again, please, because I had an interruption there.
Sure, that's all right. For identity and access governance, such as segregation of duties, how would you do the analysis? And then the follow-up question was, would you cross HR data with end system authorizations?
Oh, that's a good one. So separation of duty can get a little confusing for some people as to what it actually is capable of doing. It's either going to be the business process itself. For example, when you get into things like GDPR or organizations that are trying to make sure their contractors don't have access to certain intellectual property and things like that, separation of duty has to be done in a collaborative effort with HR to know which attributes you're going to leverage for your separation of duty policies, so that they know if they're going to change them, how they'll impact those policies. We've actually done a separation of duty attribute map for a customer so that they can publish that on a web page and everybody's aware that those are the things that are driving, from an attribute or input perspective, the things that will drive policy. So publishing those policies rather than just keeping them embedded in the workflow is a very good way to communicate those things to your HR team.
Thanks, Ron. Next question. With organizations that have a presence in many countries, would you take an inside-out approach from the headquarters to outside? How would you sell it to the C-suite? So, we've done a number of implementations for global organizations. We've got one here in Atlanta that's a large consumer packaged goods company. And, there's a huge amount of complexity there. And the nice thing about identity and access management is that you can accommodate all that variation by building your business rules and codifying all that in the logic. So the challenge is supporting such a wide, spread out, far-flung user base. It allows you a level of scalability that you just don't get any other way. So selling it to the C-suite, it really does solve a lot of the variation problems in provisioning users. It reduces your operating and support costs dramatically. And you find that administrators don't have to touch user records nearly as often in order to get the person productive and functioning. I think the other thing is that if you look at regulatory requirements in different regions, whether it's GDPR in Europe, you can work around all those regulations and provide a good end user experience and do it automatically. The next question we have is, do you find organizations have several methodologies based on the user base, so an employee versus a contractor? And I have not found that. I believe that our methodology is really based on understanding the user lifecycle regardless of the user type. Now, some of the systems that come together might require additional analysis. So I'll give you an example. So in a situation where we're managing contractor identities, HR systems are fairly well understood, fairly mature, and they operate really under the same regulatory rule set. But if you think about contractors, they don't fall under that same level of rigor. They tend to be managed in a database, they're managed in a SharePoint site, they're managed in a vendor management system. So if you're talking about a vendor management system, Well, it doesn't have the same structure and set of rules around it, and so there are some additional analysis that has to be done. So while our methodology wouldn't necessarily change, we would dig into an understanding of that vendor management system to see whether it would work or not. So at one customer, they were using Fieldglass as their vendor management system, and we dug into that system and found out that while the system was very good at managing uniqueness for vendors, it was really bad at managing uniqueness for contingent workers. So a contingent worker could apply for the same job through 3 or 4 different vendors and have 3 or 4 different identities, even though it was the same single user. And you can't manage a contractor identity if you don't have an authoritative source that is the one record with the most accurate data for that worker. So that vendor management system was thrown out as a possible system of record for the contingent workers, and they had to go in a different direction and ultimately moved their contingent workers into their HR system. Next question. For delivery to the customer, is your documentation automated as you build the identity management solution, or a manual process, or a combination of both? So our documentation is not automated. That would be lovely if we could automate that. I think that would drive additional time out of the deployment life cycle. But the good news is that the documentation is thorough, and it covers all the different areas of the methodology. It explains where the problems are, it explains how they're being addressed, it defines the future state, and it also provides strong reference material for anyone who's going to administer the system. So it will include a data map. It will include what are the event triggers, how are the different steps in the process supposed to come together, and then what does identity management do with it afterwards.
Yeah, and Hanno, if I may, if I may, the question also leans towards, our methodology is on leaning heavily more towards the operational strategy and the planning. Once the implementation occurs, many times it's a vendor selection question on how was it implemented? How are you going to capture the documentation from the application as to how it applied those policies? That's a vendor specific solution set. Some of the vendors are really good at letting you export that information into really nice documentation. Other vendors are still lacking in that area.
The next question we have is are there any additional recommendations for security admins during IAM process support? Ron, you have any thoughts on that? So any additional recommendations for security admins who are supporting the identity and access management process?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges we run into is whether or not to do things like creating a person or consider it the employee account where they have their normal account, and because they're a security admin, how do they get their elevated access when they need it? Do you create a separate account? Do you keep it as the same account? Do they have to use a PAM solution to check in and check out credentials? Those all have to be decided based upon the framework and the solution that's selected as the vendor, because every vendor has different ways and opportunities for you to manage that better. But security administrators are the ones who typically are going to be given the highest level of access, but you really should focus on minimum but necessary access for that administrator and those security people to perform their duties. A lot of times it's real easy just to say give them everything, and then you find yourself being audited and asked questions about why were they able to access something they shouldn't have accessed. So it is a process that takes on a different level of analysis than just looking at your standard joiner, mover, lever processes.
The next question we have is, what about external business partners? How would you manage the user data?
I'd be happy to respond to that if you like.
Please, Ron.
So part of what we've discovered in working primarily with global manufacturing organizations is they do bring on both partners and contractors heavily. And so we've actually worked with them to segregate them into the first primary role is to decide whether, because we use a lot of RBOC in our solution set, is to decide the employee, non-employee process, as well as lower level access controls for things as simple as VPN access. Do you grant them automatically or do they have to request them? And we profile those out right up front. It's the first thing we do is identify how do you determine the difference between your employees, your non-employees, and your partners and your customers. And we scope those into a functional process to say, out of all the functions you can get out of identity management, which ones are highest priority for your employees? Which ones are highest priority for your contractors? Which ones are highest priority for your partners and customers? And they may not always align. So you actually have to prioritize then which ones you want to solve first. And yes, the contractors are treated through the same joiner, mover, leaver process, and so are your partners and your customers. Basically, identity now is all consolidated. You have to treat them all through those same life cycles without, and still be able to get through all your audits to show that you're properly managing those credentials.
Thanks, Ron. I think those are all the questions we have today. So I wanted to thank you all for attending. I hope you got a lot of value out of this session. We will both be at Gartner, Ron and I, in early December, and you can reach out to us either at the email addresses below or at info@idenhaus.com. We hope to see you there and look forward to our next conversation. Have a great day.